What up, YouTube? Here with another episode of Talk Boxing. On this episode, I'll be giving y'all my thoughts on the current scene in heavyweight boxing. The first fight I'll be giving y'all my thoughts on was the fight that happened this past week with Daniel Dubois and Anthony Joshua, and that was for the IBF heavyweight title, and it was a record-breaking fight. And I say record-breaking because there was over 96,000 tickets sold, and that was the largest crowd attended for a boxing bout at the Wembley Stadium. And that was to my surprise. I know both fighters are based out of the UK, and I say it was a surprise because Dubois, he just recently came onto the scene as a major figure in heavyweight boxing. As y'all know, after his first defeat versus Joe Joyce, where he lost that fight via knockout, and then he was also stopped by Alexander Usyk when he challenged Usyk for the unified heavyweight titles, and then he came back on to the top of the heavyweight boxing rankings after pulling off two back-to-back major upset victories when he stopped Jarrell Miller, and then he stopped Hrgovic, and both of those fights, Dubois was not the favorite to win that fight. And then the way he defeated Hrgovic and Miller was impressive, and then that helped him climb up the ranks amongst the elites in heavyweight boxing. And as far as Anthony Joshua, similar story. As y'all know, Anthony Joshua, he suffered his first defeat in his first bout overseas in America in his U.S. debut when he got knocked out by Andy Ruiz. Then he went on his vengeance tour after getting a victory over on Ruiz, and he defeated Ruiz in that rematch via decision, and then he was able to capture back his heavyweight titles, and then he suffered another defeat to Alexander Usyk twice, and that was a outclassing performance by Alexander Usyk when he defeated Anthony Joshua to become unified heavyweight champion. And he did that by defeating Anthony Joshua twice via decision. And then Joshua went on yet another redemption tour by keep on collecting victories. And he showed a lot of improvement by adapting a new set of skills to his game. As y'all know, Anthony Joshua, he made a reputation out of being a knockout artist. And he showed that he is more than one-dimensional by adding patience to his game and him improving his jabs, and as well as him improving his movement and overall boxing fundamentals. And his recent streak has been I would say the most impressive prior to him tasting his first defeat. And I say his most recent run before this loss versus Daniel Dubois was the most impressive, because when he was green and undefeated, he was very one-dimensional. He was headhunting. He wanted to finish his opponents early, and he wanted to always score the highlight reel knockouts. And after suffering defeats, he became more intuitive and was more willing to learn the overall aspect of boxing and be a student to the sport and pick up on whatever elements and skills that was necessary for him to be great. And his streak, he knocked out Francis Ngannou, and that's not an impressive victory. And I say that because Francis Ngannou isn't a professional boxer. He's a professional MMA fighter. And the only reason why he got to step in there versus Joshua is because of how well Ngannou performed and fared well versus Tyson Fury in Ngannou's debut fight. But Joshua stopped all that, knocked out Ngannou, made quick work of him, defeated Jermaine Franklin. And when he defeated Franklin, he showed good patience, and he showed that he is more than just a headhunter and a power puncher, and he does have some boxing skills instead of him just solely relying on his power. And then he also defeated Otto Wallin, and that was an impressive performance on the part of Anthony Joshua, because I wasn't expecting Joshua to make such quick work out of Otto Wallin, and he made an example out of Otto Wallin, and he was able to stop Otto Wallin and put on a heck of a dominant performance versus Otto Wallin. And Otto Wallin is a good fighter, and I wasn't expecting Joshua to beat Otto Wallin the way he did, and I was expecting much more of a challenge from Otto Wallin when he stepped in there versus Anthony Joshua, but that wasn't the case at all. And I say that because if you look at the fight with Tyson Fury and Otto Wallin, other than Fury's fight versus Usyk and Deontay Wilder, Otto Wallin gave Tyson Fury the toughest challenge of Tyson Fury's career prior to Wilder and Usyk. And Joshua, with the reputation that he holds, I was expecting Wallin to give trouble to Joshua, but if y'all saw that fight, that wasn't how the fight played out. Joshua was dominant. He won all rounds prior to Otto Wallin being stopped. And then the other victory that Joshua had before getting in there with Dubois was over on Robert Helenius, and he was able to knock out Helenius, but that was expected because Helenius is a journeyman status fighter. And Joshua, with this momentum that he carried heading into this fight versus Dubois, I was favoring Joshua to win because of how good he looked in those 4 victories that he collected prior to him fighting Daniel Dubois. And Anthony Joshua, he might have not fought a fighter that's on the level of a Filip Hrgovic, who was undefeated prior to losing to Daniel Dubois. And Dubois made it a very tough fight for Hrgovic. It was a back and forth action. I made a post-fight video to that fight as well. If y'all haven't seen any footages of that fight, and if y'all haven't tapped into my post-fight video to the Dubois versus Hrgovic fight, it's on another episode of Talk Boxing. Y'all can go check that out if y'all want. And Hrgovic, he was the favorite to win that fight versus Dubois. Dubois won that fight very well deservingly. And then as well as his fight versus Jarrell Miller, it was supposed to be another step-up win for Jarrell Miller, who was building up momentum before he was stopped by Daniel Dubois. And Dubois was supposed to be that stepping stone for both Miller and Hrgovic to climb up amongst the higher ranks in heavyweight boxing, but Dubois shot that dream down. And Anthony Joshua, as I had said, other than Otto Wallin, when I look at the caliber of opponents for both Dubois and Joshua heading into this fight, Dubois fought the more tougher opponents because he wasn't the favorite in that fight versus both Jarrell Miller and Filip Hrgovic. It was more 50-50 of a fight for the Jarrell Miller fight, speaking as a betting man. But for sure, Hrgovic was supposed to be the favorite to come out on top versus Daniel Dubois. But Dubois was able to pull off that upset versus Filip Hrgovic. And Dubois, a lot of fans was expecting him to pull off a triple upset victory versus Joshua. But Joshua, because of the reputation that he holds, it was going to be much tougher, and it would have been much more of a riskier bet for a betting man to place their bets on Dubois versus such a experienced veteran who's been fighting amongst the top of the heavyweights for years now, and as one of the biggest draws in heavyweight boxing, and I could say of all time. it was much more riskier for those that were on Dubois' side to bet on Dubois to win versus Joshua. And in fact, he did. He was able to stop Joshua in the 5th round via knockout. And for Dubois to win via knockout versus Joshua, now Joshua has shown signs of him not being as durable when it comes to his stamina. And scientifically speaking, the way Joshua is built, he's got a lot of muscle mass. And typically, when you talk about fighters that have the body of a Anthony Joshua, they tend to lack when it comes to stamina. And heavier built fighters or athletes overall tend to gas out easier than smaller athletes because of their muscle mass and because of the body weight that they carry. And Joshua has a lot of muscle mass, and majority of his body weight comes from his muscles. And that's why when it comes to durability and endurance, Joshua has been criticized when it comes to those aspects. And he has also shown signs of his chin not being durable as well. And we saw that in his fight versus Vladimir Klitschko when he first tasted the canvas. But he showed determination in that fight because he was able to answer back from those knockdowns and was able to knock out Vladimir Klitschko. And that was his biggest step-up fight from him being a prospect to being a legitimate champion. And then he got knocked out by Andy Ruiz, and he's been staggered before, and he's been hurt in other fights as well where he got hit with a solid shot, and Joshua looked like he was in deep waters and was in trouble of almost looking like he was about to get knocked out. And in this fight, we saw that play out again from the first round, from the sound of the bell to the end of the fight. Because Daniel Dubois, how he came out like a blazing fire. He didn't look to warm up or look to stylistically figure out how Joshua was going to play out this fight. He went in there swinging for the fences, and he found success from the get-go. He scored a knockdown in the first round by landing a solid straight right hand that landed flush on Anthony Joshua, dropping him. Yet again, this is nothing new to Joshua because Joshua has been dropped before. And Joshua has tasted the canvas, and he's been in trouble like this before. And the first knockdown was an indicator that the fight was gonna favor Dubois, and Joshua didn't have the answer for Dubois' onslaught all throughout the fight. Throughout the entirety of the fight, Dubois kept on coming at him, and Joshua could not find the distance where he could fight at a comfortable pace to have Dubois back up off of him. And Joshua doesn't have great footwork. He is not a natural fighter when it comes to fighting off his back foot. His style isn't a defensive, slick boxer style. As y'all know, he made a reputation out of knocking out his opponents, being an aggressive fighter, a headhunter, and he looks for that knockout shot. And he only adapted this style where he shows patience, where he tries to time his opponents and catch his opponent with a opening opportunity for him to land that perfect power shot with that devastating power that he carries. And that's when he had first tasted defeat, and that's when he added that aspect to his game where he looks for opening opportunities to land that power shot when his opponents slip up and make a technical mistake. And Dubois didn't give that opportunity to Joshua. He didn't show respect to the authority and power that Joshua carried. Dubois, he is quite solid when it comes to, I was looking for the correct word to use, because Dubois does have a strong chin and he could take a lot of shots from his opponents, even though he's been knocked out before. And Dubois, he is durable. He's got a strong chin. And how they had casted Dubois prior to him now being the IBF heavyweight champion, he was casted off to the side to be a gatekeeper, a journeyman after his defeat to Joe Joyce. And then he got victories after his first professional defeat. And then he got stopped by Alexander Usyk. And that was a competitive fight. Other than Usyk's fight versus Derek Chisora, that was Usyk's most competitive fight that Usyk fought in. And Dubois, a lot of people do think that when he landed that body shot on Usyk, which was considered a low blow, they said it's questionable to be a legitimate legal shot. That could have been a knockout win for Dubois for him to become unified majority heavyweight champion. And he performed quite well versus Alexander Usyk, even though Usyk did get the better of him overall in that fight. And I talked about that for that specific fight. I made a post-fight video to that fight. If y'all haven't tapped into that, go tap into it if y'all want. And if y'all haven't seen that fight with Usyk and Dubois, y'all can go tap into that fight as well. And Dubois, as I had said, this is a great story because Dubois, the way he's been promoted, he hasn't been promoted like a Anthony Joshua or a Tyson Fury or a Deontay Wilder or a Alexander Usyk or a Derek Chisora, Dillian White, and a strong boxing country like England. Dubois still had a lot of support. Now he's got more support than ever. But prior to that, as I had mentioned, Dillian White and Derek Chisora, guys like that had more of a following in the local UK boxing scene than Daniel Dubois. Dubois, if y'all look at his fight, his last two fights before fighting Anthony Joshua, that fight was in Saudi Arabia when he fought Hrgovic and Bout Jarrell Miller. And now that he got that fight versus Anthony Joshua, that fight had to be in the UK, and majority of the drawing power obviously came from Anthony Joshua because he's been a household staple name for not only UK heavyweight boxing, but boxing overall. And Daniel Dubois, now that he scored this upset win yet again over on Anthony Joshua, this is 3 straight upset wins for Daniel Dubois. And this is for sure the biggest one because Hrgovic and Jarrell Miller does not have the following that Anthony Joshua has. And for Dubois to pull off this impressive 5th round knockout win over Anthony Joshua in front of 96,000 people in an all-time record-breaking boxing fight in Wembley Stadium, he's going to have more following than ever. And he's got a championship belt to support that. As y'all know, Alexander Usyk is not the IBF heavyweight champion anymore, and that's probably because when Hrgovic fought Daniel Dubois, it was for the interim IBF heavyweight title, and Dubois won that fight, and I guess Alexander Usyk's camp did not want to rematch Daniel Dubois. And y'all know how the politics is when it comes to boxing, and the sanctioning bodies, if they don't have that fight made that is according to their title organization's rankings, they tend to have their champion, whoever the champion is at that specific weight class, vacate that title if they don't fight the mandatory challenger that they have for him. And Dubois, after defeating Hrgovic, became the mandatory challenger to challenge for the IBF heavyweight title. Hence why after Alexander Usyk was stripped of the IBF heavyweight title, the IBF had made Daniel Dubois become the legitimate IBF heavyweight champion. And Daniel Dubois, in his first defense of his IBF heavyweight title, he was successful in defending his IBF heavyweight title by knocking out Anthony Joshua in the 5th round. And before he got that 5th round knockout, he dropped Anthony Joshua 3 times. As I had said, the first round, he dropped Anthony Joshua with that straight right hand. And then at the end of the 2nd round, he landed a flush left hook when Joshua had his head ducked under, trying to avoid the onslaught and flurries coming from Daniel Dubois. And his gloves touched the canvas, but the referee didn't consider that a knockdown for whatever reason. It was almost at the end of the round. Then Joshua, he sat on the ropes to have his back supported from getting dropped. And Daniel Dubois kept on going to work and kept on landing powerful, solid shots. And eventually, Anthony Joshua would hit the canvas for the 2nd time. He'd get back up. But from that first knockdown, Joshua wasn't the same because he was delirious. The lights were on, but nobody was home. Joshua was floating from that first knockdown because Joshua did not have his footing under him. He couldn't find his balance, and Daniel Dubois took advantage of that all fight long. And then in the 3rd round, Joshua was able to collect himself better than the first 2 rounds. Dubois kept on coming at him and kept on closing the gap. Joshua, he was establishing that jab, or was trying to, for him to create that space between him and Dubois, and for Dubois to stop coming at him. And however, Joshua couldn't legitimately establish that jab to keep Dubois off of him. And Dubois kept on coming at him. It's not a single round that I had scored in favor of Anthony Joshua in this fight. Dubois, he was aggressive. He was relentless. He kept on coming and charging at Joshua. And he kept on coming at him with power shots. That overhand right hand was working like a charm for Dubois. And he was accurate. And Anthony Joshua does not have the best head movement, does not have the best lateral movement. He's not good at fighting off his back foot. He's good at establishing that jab. The reason why his jab has improved had a lot to do with the power that Joshua carries in his hands. And with the heavy hands that Joshua has, that jab, whenever he throws and lands at his opponent, he tends to back his opponent off of him because of the power that is behind Joshua whenever he would throw whatever punch he throws. But with Dubois, because of Joshua's natural style, he couldn't find his target with the jab. And Joshua, if he doesn't land first and his opponent lands before him, Joshua doesn't have a good defensive reaction from getting hit. And Joshua, as I had said, he's not a slick defensive fighter. He doesn't have the best head and upper body movement. He doesn't have the best footwork. Naturally, he is an aggressive, come-forward fighter that goes after his opponents and headhunts and looks for power shots to land to finish his opponents as quick as possible. And that's a style that Dubois brought towards Joshua. And Joshua couldn't neutralize Dubois' game plan. And that style that Joshua had developed, and it's not really a style that Joshua developed. It was more of a style that Joshua was trying out by adding different arsenals to his game to make him not be one-dimensional, as I have mentioned before. And when Dubois kept on coming at him with his onslaught, he couldn't show off these new arsenals that he added to his game. And he kept on trying to back Dubois off of him with that jab, but that was the only punch he tried to use. And it looked as if Joshua was trying that style out of looking for windows of opportunities where Dubois has his guard down, or when Dubois runs out of stamina and he looks for a counter opportunity where there is a open opportunity for Joshua to sneak in a power shot for Dubois to get hit with, and maybe that'll get Dubois to back up off of him, because a power shot from Joshua would be devastating, and Dubois would have no choice but to back up off of him if Joshua was able to land a power shot when Dubois would slip up. But fortunately for Dubois, he didn't slip up. And yet again, the next round, Dubois would drop Joshua again with a flush overhand right hand. Joshua was able to get back up to answer the referee's 10 count. However, his footing wasn't still under him, and he didn't have the answer for Dubois' onslaught. But in the 5th round, Joshua looked as if he found a breathing room, because he landed a straight right hand where it hurt Dubois, and he caught Dubois coming in with a straight right hand. And when Dubois got caught with that straight right hand, when he looked to close that gap and kept on coming at him the way he was coming at him, and he got caught with a flush shot, and Dubois was affected by that, and Joshua would land 2 or 3 more straight right hands. And when Joshua looked to change it up by attempting to land a left uppercut, Joshua wasn't thinking. He got too caught up in the moment, and he had his guard down. He didn't have his hands up on his backhand when he looked to land that left uppercut. And Dubois, smartly for him, saw that and landed a sneak right hand, a right hook, a short overhand right hook that landed flush on the chin of Joshua, and Joshua was knocked out from that. He hit the canvas, and he wasn't able to answer the referee's 10 count. The referee was counting, and Joshua was out. And Dubois scored that 5th round knockout, and in his first defense of his IBF heavyweight title, he was successful. And this is, without a shadow of a doubt, the most impressive victory of Daniel Dubois' career. Now, what's next for both fighters? Daniel Dubois, I think the most marketable fight next for Dubois will be versus Jarrell Zhang. And both fighters fight with the Riyadh season, Turkey Adish's promotion. And that would be an easy fight to make happen, because both Frank Warren and Matchroom, well, I think both Jarrell Zhang and Daniel Dubois work with Frank Warren and Queensberry Boxing, and they work both with Riyadh season and the Zone. That's why that fight would be an easy fight to make happen. And both fighters fight in the UK and Saudi Arabia. And with Daniel Dubois, he's on a hot streak, and it's no point for Dubois to fight a lesser-known opponent after defeating one of the most well-known names, not only in heavyweight boxing, but all of boxing. And Jarrell Zhang isn't that much of a draw, but after Jarrell Zhang and his victory over on Deontay Wilder, Jarrell Zhang's credibility when it comes to marketability has gone up the stock market. Hence why that fight makes sense, promotionally speaking and competitively speaking as well. And that's why I think that fight would be the most sensible fight to make happen next. And it would be a good competitive fight as well. I can confidently say that's a 50-50 fight, and they both got similar stories when it comes to their record. Both of Daniel Dubois' losses might have been via knockout, but you look at Jarrell Zhang's 2 defeats to Hrgovic and Joseph Parker. Both fights were close decision victories, and Zhilei Zhang has got a heck of a chin on him, and that is a hard opponent to stop. Hence why that would be a very tough fight for the new IBF heavyweight champion, Daniel Dubois. That would be a tough challenge for both fighters, and both fighters are durable. Both fighters are heavy hitters, and I think that would be a heck of a heavyweight bout for the IBF heavyweight title. Definitely a title-worthy fight for Daniel Dubois to fight Zhilei Zhang. And Zhilei Zhang is, I believe, the number 4 ranked contender according to the IBF. And the number 1 ranked IBF contender is a undefeated German heavyweight fighter who knocked out Frank Sanchez and giving Frank Sanchez his first professional defeat. And that man's name is Agit Caballo. He's got plenty of experience. That would be a tough challenge for Daniel Dubois as well. And it would be promotionally and title-wise a easy fight to make happen as well for Daniel Dubois to defend his IBF heavyweight title versus the number 1 ranked IBF contender in Agit Caballo for the IBF heavyweight title. And as far as Anthony Joshua goes, surprising to my knowledge, I saw this on the dirt sheets that Deontay Wilder announced that he isn't going to retire. And I think this is the only sensible fight left for both Deontay Wilder and Anthony Joshua. And both fighters came up relatively together at the same time when they were both champions. And when they were both champions, that was a dream fight that all boxing fans wanted to see. Similar styles, both heavy hitters. Their bodies are built different, but when it comes to their styles, it's almost identical. That's why that fight still be a big draw, and both Wilder and Joshua have the ability to draw huge crowds. Hence why that fight, it doesn't have the steam that it once had because of how their careers turned out, but it'll still be a fan-friendly affair for Joshua and Wilder to get in there. And then I say that's probably the last fights left. The only last fight left for both Joshua and Wilder, because what more do both former champions got to prove? They've cemented a heck of a legacy, a good career that they could confidently say that they're proud of. And Joshua versus Wilder, I think, would be the most sensible fight to make happen next. And as y'all know, Deontay Wilder, after leaving PBC, he decided to sign with Matchroom, and that's the promotional company that Anthony Joshua has been working with throughout his whole entire career. That's why that would be an in-house Matchroom bout. And if Wilder doesn't want to fight in the UK, even though that's where the hottest market is when it comes to the sport of boxing, and yeah, you could say Mexico and Japan and Puerto Rico, those countries are up there with the UK when it comes to local support, but the UK got the crown when it comes to the most healthiest, lively domestic boxing scene. That's why it would make the most sense for a all in-house Matchroom bout to happen where Matchroom is based out of in the UK, and that would definitely be a sellout soccer stadium or football stadium as they call it in the UK. They could sell out the Wembley for a fight with Joshua and Wilder, because that's the type of support that the local fans out there in the UK have for the sport of boxing. If not, then they could have the fight in Saudi Arabia for neutral grounds, because Matchroom and DAZN work closely with Riyadh season. That's why if Wilder and his team don't want to go over there where Anthony Joshua was from in their territory, then they could have a fight, have that fight being hosted in Saudi Arabia. Regardless, it's going to do numbers. But that's what I suggest to be next for both Dubois and Anthony Joshua. The heavyweight boxing scene right now is quite lively. And then there's other top fighters amongst the heavyweights as well. There's Joseph Parker, who's the current interim WBO heavyweight champion, and that's currently held by Alexander Usyk. All the other titles other than the IBF title is held by Alexander Usyk after he defeated Tyson Fury. And Joseph Parker, if he doesn't get another fight versus Joe Joyce to avenge that loss, then after he defeated Zhilei Zhang and Deontay Wilder in impressive back-to-back decision wins, then he could perhaps go for an IBF title shot versus Daniel Dubois. And both Joseph Parker's last fights were broadcasted on the Zone and worked with Matchroom and Riyadh season, and that's why that fight could be an in-house bout. And Queensberry works often with Matchroom, hence why that fight with Parker and Dubois would be an easy fight to make happen as well. Then there's Martin Bakole as well, and I'm going to talk about Bakole's fight versus Jared Anderson on this episode of Talk Boxing as well. And Bakole, other than his first professional defeat, he's had 10 straight wins, and that has to have him amongst the top ranks in heavyweight boxing. And that fight was on the Zone, and I don't know the promotional deal with Bakole, but that'd be a tough fight for Dubois as well. And stylistically speaking, it called for a good fight between Dubois and Bakole. And those are few names that I threw out there who Dubois can fight next in defense of his IBF title. And then moving on to the next fight that I'm going to be giving y'all my post-fight thoughts on is the bout between Andy Ruiz and Jarrell Miller. And this fight was a comeback fight for Andy Ruiz because Ruiz has been inactive for almost, a year or two after his win over on Luis Ortiz. And Jarrell Miller, this was his bounce-back fight after being stopped by Daniel Dubois. And this fight ended in a majority draw with one of the judges scoring this bout 116 to 112 in favor of Miller, while the other two judges had this fight scored a draw. I personally had this fight scored 115 to 113 in favor of Jarrell Miller. I thought Jarrell Miller did enough to edge out Andy Ruiz in this bout. And other than the first two rounds, Jarrell Miller was slow to start this bout, and Andy Ruiz was giving him trouble with his reputable hand speed, and Jarrell Miller didn't have an answer for the hand speed of Andy Ruiz, and Ruiz's hand speed was giving trouble, and Ruiz was accurate in landing those fast, cumulative shots on Jarrell Miller. And Jarrell Miller, he was more just walking down and trying to figure out the rhythm and the pace of Andy Ruiz, and wasn't throwing much, and Ruiz was mixing up his punches, going upstairs and downstairs, and that speed, that hand speed, was giving trouble to Jarrell Miller. And Jarrell Miller isn't the fastest fighter on foot and hand speed wide as well. And then as the fight progressed, after the third round and fourth round, Jarrell Miller, it wasn't the power of Andy Ruiz that was giving trouble. It was the hand speed of Andy Ruiz that was stopping Jarrell Miller at his tracks. But once Jarrell Miller got used to the punches of Andy Ruiz, Jarrell Miller kept on coming at Andy Ruiz, and he started to open up more and started to get more comfortable. And Andy Ruiz couldn't establish that jab, and once Jarrell Miller started opening up and started digging to the body, he started throwing jabs at the body, and he started to close that gap between him and Ruiz, and he started landing some significant blows that was hurting Ruiz, and that kept on backing Ruiz to the ropes and forcing Ruiz to fight off his back foot, and that neutralized the hand speed of Andy Ruiz. And Jarrell Miller kept on going to work, kept on landing body shots, and kept on closing the distance, making the fight an inside fight, and kept on throwing overhand right hands that was landing flush. And whenever he would land power shots on Andy Ruiz, Ruiz would show signs of being affected by those shots, and Ruiz, he would be more accurate. And whenever he would counter, when he saw opportunities, because Jarrell Miller is not the best defensive fighter, that's when Ruiz was able to collect points over on Jarrell Miller. And this was a competitive back and forth bout. It was a entertaining, fan-friendly style affair. And Jarrell Miller, I thought, as I had said, outworked Andy Ruiz. And Jarrell Miller was landing the more solid, crisp punches and was doing the more effective work. And he was doing more damage than Andy Ruiz. And Ruiz looked as if he was just trying to fight off Jarrell Miller. And Jarrell Miller kept on pursuing the action. And that's what had favored Jarrell Miller in my scorecard for this bout. And do I personally want to see a rematch? Not really, because this was a close competitive bout, but I had thought that Jarrell Miller did enough to edge out Andy Ruiz. Now, this was an important fight for both fighters because both fighters, well, as for Andy Ruiz, he was successful in defeating his last opponent prior to fighting Jarrell Miller, but because of his inactivity, he wanted to come out looking impressive and dominant and get yet another impressive win to put him amongst the title contention level after that year or two of a layoff. And Jarrell Miller, after being stopped by Daniel Dubois, which isn't a bad look, especially after talking about Daniel Dubois' performance versus Anthony Joshua in his last fight, and then how he defeated Filip Hrgovic and Jarrell Miller. Jarrell Miller has no shame in losing that fight. And prior to losing to Daniel Dubois, Jarrell Miller was on a hot streak. And he wanted to catapult himself on that streak again, and he did that, and he had the right guy. Andy Ruiz is a well-accomplished former heavyweight champion who's gotten in there with impressive heavyweight names. He's got a victory over on Anthony Joshua, Chris Arreola, Luis Ortiz. Names like that, Andy Ruiz being a well-known name like that, Jarrell Miller, there was no other better opponents for Jarrell Miller to get a bounce-back fight versus. And as I had said, this was a good performance on the part of Jarrell Miller and also a good performance on the part of Andy Ruiz. For as long as Andy Ruiz hasn't been active, to get in there with Jarrell Miller and perform the way he did, this wasn't the best Andy Ruiz performance, but this wasn't nothing that wasn't expected of Andy Ruiz. It almost reminded me of the second fight that Ruiz had versus Anthony Joshua. He didn't look the best. I don't know if he didn't prepare well. I'm quite sure he has no excuses as far as his preparation for this fight, because his rematch versus Anthony Joshua, his preparation for that fight during his training camp, he was soaking in that glory of pulling off that upset win and being a champion from being a not well-known fighter that was supposed to be a stepping stone for Anthony Joshua to step up amongst the ranks in heavyweight boxing, for Anthony Joshua to have a showcase in America in his debut fight, and for him to play a spoiler to that. He was soaking in all that glory that was going towards him for pulling off that win versus Anthony Joshua, that he didn't focus fully for that rematch versus Anthony Joshua, and he looked frustrated in that fight versus Anthony Joshua when they rematched. And this reminded me a lot of that, because Jarrell Miller, after he was able to get through the hand speed that was creating distance between him and Ruiz was frustrated, and he would answer back only through counter punches by landing fast, crisp counter shots when Jarrell Miller was throwing haymakers, and it was more like in between punches or whenever Jarrell Miller would gas out. And that was a frustrating part for Andy Ruiz. And as far as Jarrell Miller goes, Jarrell Miller, he fought the way he usually fights, and there's still rooms of opportunity for Jarrell Miller to add to his arsenal, add more arsenals to his game. And if they do have a rematch, I don't think it's going to be a headliner. It could probably be for a undercard. But Andy Ruiz, I don't know what his promotional thing is. I don't know if he's still with PBC. I know this fight was broadcasted on the Zone, and Top Rank worked with Ruiz season and Matchroom and Golden Boy. It was like a co-venture bout. I don't know if PBC was involved in it, but Andy Ruiz, for the majority part of his career, he fought with PBC. But now all the heavyweights are with Matchroom and The Zone and Queensberry and Ruiz season. And Andy Ruiz, if he was featured on a card that was promoted by The Zone, then I'm quite sure if they do have a rematch, they could be featured on another stacked card for a second bout because of how this fight resulted. And if not, then Jarrell Miller can fight guys like Frank Sanchez, Philip Hargovic, Joseph Parker, Zhele Zhang, Martin Bakole, and names like that, Frank Sanchez. And there's also guys like Ife Agjagba, Mahmoud Jar, and Andy Ruiz also can fight these same guys that I mentioned as well for their next bout if they don't rematch. And there's also guys like Fabio Wardley and Martin Bakole. And speaking of Martin Bakole, that's the next fight that I'm going to be giving y'all my post-fight thoughts on. The fight that happened between Martin Bakole and Jared Anderson. And this fight wasn't that much of an upset because Martin Bakole, he was on a hot streak. He won 9 prior fights before winning his 10th by knocking out Jared Anderson in the 5th round. And Jared Anderson, heading into this fight prior to this first defeat, which was a hard one to take because Bakole knocked him out in the 5th round. And it was a dominant performance on the part of Martin Bakole. And Martin Bakole, he is known to be a slugger. He carries a lot of power with him in his hands. And Jared Anderson also had a reputation for carrying a lot of power in his hands, and he had been building a lot of hype heading into this fight. He was supposed to be like the next Deontay Wilder, the next best American hope in American heavyweight boxing. And Martin Bakole shot that dream down, and this wasn't that much of a surprise to avid boxing fans because Martin Bakole, he only had one defeat prior to, one defeat he still has on his record, and that was a controversial one because he hurt his shoulder when he was stopped by Michael Hunter, who is also a top-ranked heavyweight fighter. And that fight right there was a learning lesson for Martin Bakole, and ever since that fight, he's been winning. As I said, Martin Bakole won 10 straight fights, and not to take credit away from Hunter, but Bakole did hurt his shoulder during that fight. And Jared Anderson versus Martin Bakole, this fight was arguably the best fight featured on that card. It was a slugfest. Martin Bakole, he dropped Jared Anderson in the first round with a straight right hand, and that was Bakole's best weapon throughout the whole entire fight. And Jared Anderson, he talked about how Bakole's a standing target. He's one-dimensional. He's flat-footed. Yeah, sure, but Jared Anderson didn't have the skills to back off Martin Bakole from off of him. And Jared Anderson, he showed better hand speed, better footwork, but Bakole was able to track him down and walk him down and follow his footsteps wherever Anderson decided to go. And you could tell the power difference. Bakole, he's much more heavy-handed than Anderson is. Anderson might have been a hybrid. He tried to box circles around him, but that was of no effect. And whatever Anderson was accumulating on Bakole, Bakole was very well observant, and he showed no effects from the onslaught that Anderson was bringing towards him. But whenever Bakole would land shots on Anderson, Anderson would get badly damaged by Bakole's shots. And Anderson, he landed more flush shots. Well, not more flush shots. He landed more shots. He was more accurate. but that's because Bakole was a standing target, and he would just absorb shots to give shots back. And the flush shots come from Bakole, and whenever Bakole would land, and whenever Bakole would throw, he would land. He was accurate, and Anderson doesn't have the best defense. He is still a prospect, and he is still a little green, and Bakole showed that in this fight. And much credit to Anderson because he hung in there, he was tough, and he was relentless, and he never gave up. And Bakole, he is very durable, and Bakole can observe whatever is thrown at him. And in the fifth round, he dropped Anderson 3 times, and when Anderson got knocked down for the 4th time, it was enough that the referee had seen Anderson suffer, and that's what called the referee to stop the bout. And Bakole kept on landing significant blows, and you could see those effects shown on Anderson by the way how Anderson was looking. Anderson, his face was turning red, the mouth of Anderson was bleeding, and that goes to show the damage that Bakole was accumulating on Anderson throughout the fight. And the 2nd and 3rd and 4th round, Anderson was doing a good job at outboxing Bakole with his mobility and his movement and his hand speed and his footwork and his ring generalship. But Bakole was still able to be wherever Anderson was. And Bakole was doing a good job at cutting off the ring versus Anderson. And Bakole, he was very patient. He knew what he was doing. He was very methodical. And he was looking very George Foreman-like in his performance versus Jarrell Anderson. And Bakole, and in his victory over on Anderson, which most casual boxing fans and sports fans consider an upset because of all the hype that was built amongst Anderson. Now that Bakole got a victory over on Anderson, this catapults Bakole up to be more marketable, and this should put Bakole to have more marketable fights, more lucrative fights. He could fight guys like Joseph Parker for an interim WBO heavyweight title. That would be a tough challenge for Joseph Parker. He could fight a guy that is well known out there in the UK like Derek Chisora, or a Dillian White, a Joe Joyce, and he would be a favorite to beat all 3 of those guys. And Bakole could fight guys like Philip Hrgovic, who's going to look to bounce back from his defeat versus Daniel Dubois. There's also Jarrell Miller, Andy Ruiz, Deontay Wilder, Anthony Joshua. There's these names that Martin Bakole could have a fight versus next. That would be a good look for Martin Bakole. And this is my thoughts on what's been going on in heavyweight boxing as of recent. And that is it for this episode of Talk Boxing. If y'all enjoyed this content, like this video, share this video if y'all want, subscribe if y'all want, and hit the links in the description if y'all want to show y'all support for this channel. Anything will be appreciated. And with that being said, be good, y'all, and peace.